Part 2. Inferno. Chapter 4. Friday night. On Friday, April the 25th, Pripyat residents were looking forward to the weekend. The previous one had been anything but restful, as the party authorities had turned Saturday, April the 19th, into an unpaid workday, a yearly ritual to mark the birthday of Vladimir Lenin. Had the father of the Soviet state possessed the life everlasting that the media claimed for his ideas, he would have turned 116 at April the 22nd. Not an anniversary of any significance, but that did not matter. Ostensibly, work on the weekend closest to Lenin's birthday was a volunteer activity, but in reality party officials demanded it. Mikhail Gorbachev skipped the occasion as he was on an official visit to the German Democratic Republic, pushing his acceleration ideas there, but his compatriots did not let him down. The Politburo in Moscow reported that 159 million people all over the Soviet Union took part in the event, more than half the recorded population. According to the Pripyat newspaper, the ubiquitous Tribuna Energetica, citizens were eager to participate in Red Saturday, as the authorities called it. A city official reported, in an article titled The Holiday of Labour, that more than 22,000 of his fellow citizens had gone to work that Saturday for free. Workers at the nuclear plant and other city enterprises had produced goods and services valued at more than 100,000 rubles, while the contribution of those involved in construction exceeded 220,000 rubles. The main action was, of course, on block number 5, where, according to internal party reports, delays were increasing. The newspaper claimed the construction workers were doubling their efforts. One crew had managed to pour 30 cubic meters of concrete, which apparently was an achievement significant enough to be praised. It received its due in an article titled Return in Full. The next weekend was supposed to be free of such duties. Quite a few young couples in Pripyat were getting ready to hold their weddings on April the 26th. Sundays were normally reserved for the registration of newborns. Komsomol, Young Communist League, organizers were happy to reserve premises and lend ideological approval to the wedding ritual, formerly part of church tradition, but now not only secularized, but heavily ideologized. Newlyweds were expected to lay flowers on monuments to Lenin and memorials to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. Since Gorbachev had initiated an anti-alcohol campaign, party and Komsomol officials were pushing for alcohol-free weddings. There were few takers in Pripyat. The authorities would count it as a success if weddings did not end in drunken brawls between plant workers and Rexes, that is, the construction workers from the villages. Wedding or no wedding, everyone was glad that the weather had finally improved. It was unseasonably warm, with temperatures in the 70s Fahrenheit. For many, that meant 2 or even 3 days of picnics, hiking and fishing in the neighbouring forests along the Pripyat River and its tributaries. Not for nothing had Chernobyl entered the annals of history as a princely hunting ground. The hunting season was still distant, but fishing had already begun. On that Friday, Tribuna Energetica ran a photo on its back page featuring a young Pripyat resident with a huge catfish in his arms. The caption read, "Such a catch deserves to be in the red corner." The reference was to makeshift propaganda displays organized by party officials at workplaces. Judging by the image, the catfish weighed at least 40 pounds, and the caption suggested that such a prize catch deserved public recognition. The newspaper carried all important information about the fishing season. While fishing was generally prohibited until early June, the end of the spawning season, the authorities allowed limited fishing in areas where spawning was not taking place. The article accompanying the photo identified spots on the Dnieper, Pripyat and Uj rivers where onshore fishing was legal. Members of fishing and hunting associations could catch up to 3 kilograms of valuable fish daily, including carp and bream, and up to 10 kilograms of less valuable or common fish, such as crucian carp or bleak. Those not belonging to associations were allowed only 2 kilograms of valuable fish and 5 kilograms of common fish. The newspaper said nothing about fishing in the Chernobyl power plant's cooling pond, which the chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, had recently advertised as a perfect place for breeding fish. Fishing there was strictly prohibited, but still widely popular. Quite a few plant workers fished from the pond at night as the fishing inspectors slept, not from the shore, but from boats. While the Pripyat Tribuna Energetica catered to the tastes of urbanites getting ready for a pleasant weekend outdoors, the Chernobyl newspaper, Prapor Peremohi, Flag of Victory, with a largely rural readership, the town of Chernobyl, located about 16 kilometers southeast of Pripyat, continued to serve as the administrative center of the traditionally rural district around it, was preparing peasants for a busy weekend of collecting birch sap and planting potatoes, one of the region's main agricultural exports, and the peasants' most important staple. The Saturday issue had articles of interest on both topics. It turned out that in the birch forest near Dityatki, a village south of Chernobyl that would later give its name to the main entrance point into the Chernobyl exclusion zone, a local forestry brigade had managed to collect 90 tons of birch sap and ship it to customers. Local collective farms were competing with one another in planting potatoes. Very appropriately given its name, the Peremoha Victory Farm was leading in the competition. Its headquarters were located in the village of Stichanka, which turned out to be in its last days. Its inhabitants would soon be resettled. But by far the most important information provided in the Chernobyl newspapers concerned the different types of potatoes available for planting. 2 experts, one from a Kiev research institute and the other from the Chernobyl Center for Potato Seeding, explained the pros and cons of each. This subject was also important to many Pripyat residents, some of whom had dachas or small summer houses in the neighborhood, and planted potatoes and other vegetables there. But a much larger group, mostly young men and women from Vasil Kizima's construction crews, were also getting ready to go back to their villages to help their parents plant potatoes. Good information on the best types to plant was the best gift they could offer their parents and themselves. During the long winter months, they would rely on products sent to their city apartments from their parents' plots. Best of all, the coming weekend was the beginning of a long stretch of holidays. May the 1st, International Workers' Day, was a statutory holiday in the Soviet Union. Orthodox Easter, officially ignored by the authorities but widely celebrated, was coming up on Sunday, May the 4th. The week after that would also be a short one. May the 9th, marking victory in World War II, was a statutory holiday widely celebrated by the authorities and average people alike. Friday, April the 25th, was the last opportunity to take care of unfinished business before the holiday mood took over the entire city, making it difficult, if not impossible, to get anything done before mid-May. Like everyone else in Pripyat, Viktor Brukhanov was looking forward to a restful weekend. He badly needed one. Ever since his return from Moscow, Brukhanov had worked non-stop, coming home only to sleep. Now he would have an opportunity to enjoy the warm weather and the outdoors. Once, when he and his wife Valentina were bathing in the river in early April, they had encountered 2 elks in the water, an unforgettable experience. Maybe they would see the elks again, but the most important thing was that their daughter Lilia and her husband were coming from Kiev for a visit. As always, Friday was a hectic day for Brukhanov, but there was no indication of trouble that might spoil the weekend. Radioactive leaks were still occurring, but they managed to keep them under control. At the moment, there was no need to shut down any of the reactors in order to deal with the leaks, as had happened a few weeks earlier at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station in southern Ukraine, which had 2 operational units and 1 under construction. There, on April the 7th, controllers had detected radioactivity in cooling water coming from the reactor that exceeded the norm 14 times over. To fix the problem, they had to shut down the reactor for 2 weeks, stop work on the unfinished unit, and stop generating power entirely as their 3rd unit was under repair. That meant no electricity, no bonuses, and a lot of questions from party and government officials. The Chernobyl plant was working to schedule. It was considered one of the best in the industry, with an average of 5 technological accidents and equipment malfunctions per year. They were about to shut down reactor number 4, but that was for regular system checks and repairs according to industry regulations. Depending on the condition of the reactor, such repairs could take several months. The frequency of shutdowns depended on the ministry. The new all-union Minister of Energy, Mayorets, was determined to make history and get noticed by his bosses in the government by lengthening the intervals between shutdowns and decreasing the amount of time spent on repairs. Increasing the flow of energy would please the higher-ups. In 1985, the Chernobyl power plant had over-fulfilled electricity production quotas by almost 10%, partly by cutting time allocated for repairs. With much-needed shutdowns coming in 1986, the plant was scheduled to produce less energy than the previous year, and the local party authorities were not happy about it. Nevertheless, there were industry standards that neither party officials nor the minister could ignore. Unit 4's turn to stop for repairs was coming up in late April, and Brukhanov's engineers were ready to do the job. As usual in such cases, the shutdown of the reactor would be used to test its numerous systems at a low level of radioactivity. One of the tests to be conducted on the unit before shutting it down concerned the steam turbine and was designed to find a way to make the reactor more secure during SCRAM, the Safety Control Rods Activation Mechanism, which automatically inserted all the control rods into the active zone of the reactor and halted the reaction in case of emergency. The idea behind the test was fairly simple. In case of an emergency leading to the shutdown of the reactor, it was expected that the electricity would go off when the unit still needed it to pump coolant into the overheated reactor and prevent its meltdown. Emergency diesel generators were supposed to take care of that problem and provide badly needed electricity to continue pumping the water. But at present they would kick in only 45 seconds after the shutdown, creating a supply gap and thus a potential safety problem. It had to be fixed. Engineers from a research institute in the eastern Ukrainian city of Donetsk had come up with a solution to the problem. They pointed out that just as the reactor did not cool down immediately after the shutdown, so the turbine driven by residual steam pressure would also keep rotating for some time. Energy produced by that continuing rotation could be used to produce enough electricity to cover the 45-second gap. How long the rotation produced by the momentum of the turbine generator would continue, and how much energy it would produce, was the question that the Donetsk engineers wanted to answer with the help of their Chernobyl partners during the shutdown of reactor number 4. That was the essence of the test. The trick was that in order to conduct the test, which ultimately would improve the automatic shutdown mechanisms, those mechanisms would have to be disabled to stimulate a power failure and blackout of the plant. Consequently, there was a risk that the reactor might go out of control during the test itself, but no one believed it was a huge risk. The plant managers were interested in conducting the test because it would allow them to activate one more emergency safety system envisioned by the builders of the reactor. Moreover, ministry instructions required them to do so. They had attempted to run the same kind of test earlier, but it had failed because the steam turbine generator had malfunctioned. That problem had been fixed, and everything now seemed good to go. Preparations for the test had begun in March and went into full gear in mid-April. The steam turbine test was potentially the most complex part of the system checks to be completed at reactor number 4, but there were several others that had to be conducted. The task of preparing a timetable to coordinate all the tests went to one of the most experienced engineers around, Vitaly Borets. Then, in his late 40s, Borets had worked at power stations all over the Soviet Union. He had first come to Pripyat in March 1974. By that time, he had close to 12 years of experience in the nuclear industry, mostly in the closed city of Tomsk-7, a nuclear facility and town near the Siberian city of Tomsk. Unlike Tomsk itself, Tomsk-7 was not marked on any Soviet map. It was home to the first Soviet industrial nuclear power plant, launched in 1958, and its main product was weapons-grade plutonium, not electricity. In December 1963, Borets belonged to the crew that launched the station's fourth reactor, ADE-4. Like the Chernobyl reactor, the one at Tomsk-7 used a graphite moderator to slow down the neutrons that bombarded the nuclei of enriched uranium. Borets worked at the Chernobyl plant for more than 10 years before taking a job with a contractor responsible for launching reactors. Reactor shutdowns were also within his area of expertise. When asked to prepare a timetable for the tests, Borets readily agreed. He knew the plant exceptionally well. Unit 4 was the newest and, as many in Pripyat believed, the safest unit in the entire plant. It was part of the second stage of construction. It was housed not in a separate structure like Units 1 and 2, but in a duplex that it shared with Unit 3. Both units had a production capacity of up to 1,000 megawatts of electrical energy, MWE. In order to reach that capacity, they had to generate at least 3,000 megawatts of thermal energy, MWT. Their generating capacity was rated as 3,200 megawatts of thermal energy. Unit 3 had become operational in December 1981 and Unit 4 in December 1983. The protocol of the commission that inspected and launched Unit 4 had been signed by Nikolai Fomin on December 18, 1983. The protocol described the reactor's main characteristics. Its vessel was a steel cylinder over 10 meters in diameter and 7 meters high, made of high-purity graphite placed in a concrete pit almost 22 meters long, 22 meters wide, and 26 meters high. It was filled with graphite blocks to slow down the fast-moving neutrons and help them sustain a nuclear chain reaction by splitting the atoms of uranium into 2 smaller atoms and releasing kinetic energy. At the top and bottom of the cylinder were 2 massive metal plates that served as biological shields. The top one, called System E and dubbed Eleanor by the operators, was penetrated by numerous standpipes used for 2 kinds of channel assemblies, control and fuel rods. The reactor had 1,661 fuel rods or pressure channels, each approximately 3.5 meters long, filled with pellets of 2 to 3% enriched uranium-235 and natural uranium-238. There were 211 movable control rods made of boron carbide that absorbed neutrons and which could therefore slow down the fission reaction if they were inserted into the active zone or core of the reactor, or increase the speed of the reaction if they were removed from the active zone. 2 coolant loops circulated water overheated by the energy produced by the chain reaction fuel rods, conducting it to steam drums that separated the steam from the water and fed it into the turbine to produce electrical power. As with all Soviet reactors, there was no secure containment of the Unit 4 reactor except its concrete pit, but the Commission found the functioning of all systems of the reactor satisfactory. As always, there were caveats. The Commission noted problems with the reactor that would have to be fixed in the future. They recommended, among other things, that the construction of the control rods be modified. It turned out that they could produce an effect of positive reactivity or a spike in the fission reaction and increase of the reactor's power when inserted into the graphite core at a depth of less than 2 meters. The overall length of the rods was 6 meters. The adjustments that the Commission recommended had already been made to Unit 3. These improvements were supposed to take care of problems such as those experienced in 1975 at the Leningrad power plant, where a drastic rise of radioactivity and destabilization of the reactor had resulted from a positive void effect, an increase of radioactivity within the reactor caused by the loss of coolant. The details of that accident, which almost destroyed the reactor, had been withheld from the personnel of other nuclear plants, but Boretz knew firsthand how dangerous the situation had become at the Leningrad location. On November 30th, 1975, Boretz, who had been sent to the Leningrad plant from Chernobyl to undergo training on an RBMK reactor, inadvertently became a witness of the worst accident in the reactor's history. That day he decided to stay at the plant after his shift to see how the reactor would behave during the process of shifting gears, stopping the reactor and moving from one mode of operation to another. It soon became clear to Boretz that there was something wrong with the reactor. Running at a low power level, it began to increase the radiation rate, even though the operator tried to slow down the process by inserting additional control rods into the active zone of the reactor. Normally, the nuclear radiation rate decreased as operators added control rods to the active zone of the reactor, where the nuclear reaction took place and nuclear energy was released from the fuel channels. But the RBMK reactor at the Leningrad power station behaved differently. Even when the experienced operator, whose skills impressed Boretz, inserted additional rods manually, it did not slow down the rapidly increasing rate of radiation. The reactor was not behaving as expected. As far as Boretz was concerned, the reactor was out of control. Having operated reactors previously, he knew that if the rapidly rising level of radiation was not checked, it could cause an explosion. "Imagine yourself behind the steering wheel of a car," said Boretz the following day to a security official who had little understanding of nuclear physics. "You start the motor, you start moving, you accelerate smoothly, you shift gears, your speed is 60 kilometers per hour. You take your foot off the gas pedal, and suddenly the car independently begins to increase speed to 80, 100, 130, 150 kilometers per hour. You brake to no effect. The speed keeps increasing. How would you feel?" The ungovernable reactor was stopped twice by means of SCRAM, the emergency system which halted the reaction. An explosion was averted, but because of spikes in the strength of the reaction, one of the fuel channels inside the reactor core melted, releasing uranium into the core. The reactor was shut down. It was cleaned the following day with nitrogen, and the waste, amounting to 1.5 million curies of radionuclides, was released into the environment through the exhaust pipe. 1 curie is equivalent to the amount of radiation released by the fission of 37 billion atoms. It can contaminate 10 billion quarts of milk, making them unfit for human consumption. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, a safe level of nuclear contamination of a territory is 5 curies per square kilometre. It is anyone's guess what impact 1.5 million curies had on the people and the territory around the station, including the city of Leningrad, less than 50 kilometres away. Vitaly Boretz never received any explanation of what had gone wrong with the reactor, and he knew nothing about this major technical weakness in the reactor design. The information was kept under wraps. The designers of the reactor made no major changes in the RBMK model. Instead, they issued instructions on how the control rods should be improved, failing to explain why that had to be done. Those instructions eventually made their way into the recommendations of the Commission that inspected reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. But everyone there believed that the problem with the rods was a minor one. The lessons of the Leningrad reactor's failure were not learned. There were many improvements that could be made to a reactor. But the main task of the plant's operators was to produce energy, not to design new reactors or improve existing ones. The repairs could wait. The KGB, constantly keeping a watchful eye on the plant, was generally satisfied with the condition of the two newest units. Its agents keeping track of the progress at Chernobyl believed that Units 3 and 4 were generally safer than Units 1 and 2. By 1984 they had concluded that despite serious safety issues at the plant, the general situation was improving. In 1982 there had been 3 accidents and 16 breakdowns of equipment at the 3 working units. But in the first 9 months of 1984 there had been no accidents and only 10 breakdowns. There seemed to be no reason for Vitaly Borits or anyone else to recall the accident at the Leningrad station when they were getting ready for the shutdown of reactor number 4 for testing. Borits did as he was asked. He collected information on all the proposed tests from the various units and consultants and submitted the timetables he prepared to the expert group responsible for planning the shutdown. Borits suggested that the shutdown begin on Thursday, April the 24th, at 10 p.m. The whole operation, including the shutdown test, was to end by 1 p.m. on Friday afternoon, April the 25th. The expert group replied that the shutdown should end by 10 a.m., otherwise the radioactivity level in the reactor would fall below admissible levels. Everyone agreed. The chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, signed off on the program. He later recalled that originally the shutdown had been planned for April the 23rd, but then they decided to do it over the weekend. They never submitted the program for approval by representatives of the Ministry of Energy and Electrification in Moscow or the manufacturer of the reactors, as was prescribed by instructions but rarely done in practice. The Chernobyl nuclear plant was supposed to enter the last weekend of April, with Unit 4 safely shut down. Preparations for the shutdown of reactor number 4 began not on the evening of April the 24th, as suggested by Borits, however, but with the start of the new shift of operators in the early morning hours of April the 25th. By 4:48 a.m., the power level of the reactor had been reduced by half and secured at 1,600 megawatts of thermal energy. The shutdown procedures were continued by Igor Kazachkov, the head of the morning shift in Unit 4 that took over from the night shift at 8 a.m. on April the 25th. In his mid-30s, Kazachkov was one of the most experienced shift leaders at the plant. He had come to Pripyat in 1974, immediately after graduating from the Odessa Polytechnic Institute, and risen through the ranks to his current position. In December 1985, the regional newspaper even ran a profile of him with a photo, in his white cap and gown, sporting glasses and a goatee. He was standing by the screen of one of the plant's computers. He appeared to be a thoughtful young man, and the brief article praised him for his precise organization and work discipline. Kazachkov had inherited from the night shift a reactor that had almost all its control rods inserted into the core in order to reduce the intensity of the nuclear reaction. Fewer than 15 rods were left uninserted and were still at his disposal to regulate the reactor's behavior. The manufacturer's instructions suggested the need for a shutdown when this point was reached, but neither the personnel on the night shift nor Kazachkov began the shutdown procedure. That would have been a violation of the program they had been given by their superiors. The power generator test, along with the numerous other scheduled tests and measurements, had not yet been carried out. But even more importantly, short of an extreme emergency, the reactor could be shut down and disconnected from the power grid only on orders of the plant superiors, who needed the approval of the power grid inspector in Kiev. Kazachkov later said, "Why did neither I nor my colleagues shut down the reactor when the number of protective rods, those not yet inserted into the active zone, was reduced? Because none of us imagined that that could bring on a nuclear accident. We knew that it was forbidden by the manufacturer to do so, delay the shutdown, but did not think about it. But if I had shut down the reactor, I would have gotten a severe tongue-lashing. After all, we were racing to fulfill the plan. Asked what the consequences of his shutting down the reactor might have been, Gazachkov responded, "I think they would have fired me. They would certainly have fired me. Not for that, of course, but they would have latched onto something. That particular parameter, the number of rods, was not something we considered serious." So, not overly concerned about the inadequate number of rods at his disposal, Kazachkov followed the pre-arranged program and prepared for the test by disabling the system of emergency water supply to the reactor. The process for stopping the reactor was supposed to last only a few hours, so Kazachkov considered the odds of the regular water supply system failing about as likely as that of a plane falling from the sky and hitting someone on the head. Shutting down the emergency water system was a lengthy and laborious process in which the operators had to close the valves of huge pipes by hand. That took up to 45 minutes, with teams of 2 or 3 men working on each valve. The system was shut down by around 2 p.m. They had another 15 or 20 minutes before the start of the actual shutdown of the reactor, but then came a call from the plant's administration, which wanted the reactor to maintain its current production of 1,600 megawatts of thermal energy. The shutdown and the test, which had to be carried out at a power level of 700 megawatts of thermal energy, had to be postponed. The plant's administrators changed their plans because of a call they had received from the headquarters of the Kiev area power grid, the office charged with managing the distribution and consumption of electrical power produced by the plant. It was, in fact, the Chernobyl plant's only customer. Unless there was an emergency at the plant, the power grid operator had to be reckoned with. It turned out that at the southern Ukrainian nuclear station in the Mykolaiv region, one of the units had unexpectedly gone offline, and the operator wanted the Chernobyl unit to maintain its current power level until evening, when the demand for electricity would decrease, and the plans for the shutdown of the reactor could finally proceed. No one at Unit 4 was happy with the request, especially as it came a mere 15 minutes before the start of the shutdown, with the emergency water supply system already shut off. But there was little they could do other than follow instructions from the authorities at the Kiev power grid. The electricity produced by just one unit of the Chernobyl power station was enough to keep the entire city of Kiev going, so they could not go on or offline just as they pleased. They had complained in the past about similar conflicts, but to no avail. In February 1986, the dissatisfaction of the Chernobyl power plant personnel with the grid operators had been noted in KGB reports that found their way to Moscow. In 1985 alone, there were 26 cases in which the Chernobyl operators had to change the power output of the units in response to orders from the grid dispatchers. In the first 3 weeks of 1986, there had been 9 such cases, leading to an overall decrease of power output. The reactor operators complained that RBMK 1000 reactors were designed to work at a constant level of power output, and a decrease could lead to malfunctions. Moreover, changes of power output released radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Moscow's response to the reports indicated that even the KGB was powerless to do anything about the existing practice. The ministries in Moscow responsible for nuclear energy had simply taken the problem under advisement. By 4 p.m., the evening shift had taken over the control room of the unit. Its leader, Yuri Trehub, was not familiar with the testing program. The shutdown of the reactor was supposed to be over by the time he started his shift, and he was clearly upset by the dispatcher's demand, which he considered unreasonable. "I'm surprised there could possibly be such a turn of events. A dispatcher taking command of an atomic power station," said Trehub a few months later, venting his frustration. "After all, even if we had an accident or a power interruption, the dispatcher might not give permission for a shutdown. But we're not talking about a thermal power station, a mere boiler exploding on the premises. It's always very difficult dealing with dispatchers. There are plenty of arguments. Trehub and his group of engineers tried to come to terms with the situation. By the time he took over the shift, the reactor's power level had been reduced by half from its full power output of 3,200 megawatts of thermal energy to 1,600 megawatts of thermal energy. Trehub was surprised that the safety system had been shut down. "What do you mean they turned it off?" he asked Kazachkov. "On the basis of the test program, although I objected," was the response. Kazachkov added that the power grid dispatcher was expected to give his approval for the shutdown of the reactor around 6 p.m. Accordingly, the steam turbine experiment that required the safety water supply to be turned off was postponed, not cancelled altogether. Given the difficult and laborious process of enabling and then shutting off the safety system again, Trehub decided to leave it as it was and wait for the grid dispatcher's approval, then begin the shutdown of the reactor. He discussed the situation with his immediate boss, the leader of the plant's evening shift, and they agreed that they had no choice but to stick to the approved program, which Trehub studied carefully. Not everything was clear to him, but he had no one at hand to consult with, and he was busy running the other tests on Boret's program. Most of them did not require a complete shutdown of the reactor. In front of him was a display with close to 4,000 indicators of the reactor's activity to be monitored and controlled. 6 o'clock passed with no news from the dispatcher. Around 8 p.m. the worried Trehub called the plant shift leader, still nothing. The leader advised Trehub not to proceed with the shutdown of the reactor until a deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov, arrived. Dyatlov was in charge of operating the reactors, and when it came to a shutdown, he was the ultimate authority for the personnel. Trehub called Dyatlov. It turned out that he had left his office around 4 p.m. to get some rest. Trehub eventually found Dyatlov at home and told him, in distress, "I have questions, many questions." "This is not a phone conversation. Don't start without me," came the brisk answer. Then, out of the blue, Trehub received a call from Dyatlov's boss, Nikolai Fomin himself. He also told Trehub not to start without Dyatlov. But Dyatlov would not come to the plant until they received approval from the dispatcher of the power grid to shut down the reactor. Finally, shortly after 9 p.m., word came from the dispatcher that the shutdown could start at 10 p.m. Trehub immediately called Dyatlov, whose wife, Isabella, answered that he was already on his way. They were finally ready to start shutting the reactor down. With the test scheduled to take less than 2 hours, Trehub expected that it would be conducted on his shift, before midnight on April the 25th. They had to hurry. But where was Dyatlov?